So here, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back from your weekends. This is Colin. Hi, all of that. All the pleasantries are stipulated. Here is why you must vote in those pesky off-cycle gubernatorial elections, where turnout is always lower than it is during the presidential cycles, because you don't hear anything on, Saturday Night Live or something about the gubernatorial races. But anyway, it turns out, as we are about to discuss, that governors get to decide whether you live or die. So you should probably try to know a little bit about them. And maybe people like me should be encouraged to ask them kind of value-based questions, those questions that are sometimes seen as a little bit too puffy in debates. Maybe those are the right questions. So we're going to talk about that with John Harris, who's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Politico. Not exactly that. Founding editor, that's his actual title. Founding editor and editor-in-chief of Politico magazine. And we're going to sort of talk about these kinds of essentially philosophical choices that are being made by political leaders who may or may not be trained at all in philosophy. We're also going to talk to Carl Zimmer, one of the preeminent science writers in America, about the race for a vaccine, about the presence of nationalism in some of the races for a vaccine, and anything else that we can get Carl to talk about. He basically knows everything. And then at the end, because you didn't have enough to worry about, there are murder hornets. That's actually what they're called. There's a kind of hornet called a murder hornet that has arrived on the West Coast. And we won't get you too worried about it, but you should be a little bit worried anyway. All right, so let's get going with this. John Harris, founding editor-in-chief of Politico magazine. Welcome back to our show.
Yeah, hey, Colin, nice to hear your voice again.
Well, it's nice to have you on. So, I find myself imagining a race of extraterrestrials watching this whole scenario from a distant starship, and they keep saying, I don't get it. They have new cases emerging all over the place, but they're sending people back out there. Why are they doing this? And that's basically what we're seeing right now. We're seeing states opening back up while they have emerging cases. In some cases, while they have new statistics indicating that cases are on the rise, they're opening back up. So what do we make of this? How do we understand this?
Well, look, I'm not going to make a judgment because it's outside my kind of area of expertise about the public health dimension of this, as whether a state that's opening up, such as Colorado, is doing so too early or not. What I will say is that every single governor, all 50 of them, is making some trade-off, some calculation, some relative judgment about values that are in tension with one another. Public health is one. The desire of people to get back on with their lives and all the benefits that come with that is the other. And it's a difficult moment for our politics because we're used to discussing issues in absolutes and in highly moralistic terms, when in fact an issue like this doesn't really lend itself to absolutes. That everybody is making judgments about what level of risk we consider acceptable and how much value we assign to different priorities that are indeed in tension with one another.
So let's hear how this sounds. Here's the governor of Colorado responding to a question from Jake Tapper on CNN's State of the Union on April 26th. A question about whether he is worried that reopening business too soon could cost human lives. Here he is.
Well, we always wish, Jake, that I had next week's information and next month's information available to me today. That's not the world we live in. We have to make the best informed decisions based on data and science with the information we have. What we know is that what matters a lot more than the date that the stay-at-home ends is what we do going forward and how we have an ongoing, sustainable way, psychologically, economically, and from a health perspective, to have the social distancing we need at workplace, where people recreate, and across the board.
So, John, as you point out, moral relativism is sometimes flung around as kind of an epithet, or at least a degraded form of thinking. And certainly it comes up when people on the right are criticizing abortion choice and stuff like that, and they really cry out for some sense of absolute morality. But first of all, this seems like a situation that defies absolute morality. I don't think we're going to get away from moral relativism no matter what decision a governor makes, but maybe you'd like to comment.
Well, there's always an element of distortion and pretense, I would say, whenever we discuss an important policy issue in absolutes. You mentioned abortion, and that's the one that seems to really lend itself to absolutes. But then even there, people would say, well, not in cases of rape or incest. So even there, it's a qualified judgment. We don't live our lives really in absolutes. Move it away from a kind of emotionally charged issue like abortion rights and to a more simple one, whether to fly to California on vacation as soon as the airlines start flying again. You don't typically think of that as making a values-based judgment, but you actually are. You know that there's some degree of risk associated with hopping on the plane versus staying at home. You'll say, well, I'll accept that amount of risk because I want to go to Yosemite. We do that all the time. Ordinarily, unlike in this pandemic, we're not confronted in such a visceral way with the trade-off. Of course, if you were Governor Polis in Colorado, if your absolute goal was protecting every single life, you'd say, no way am I opening up. Maybe not till a year from now, if you were interested in saving every single life. But you say, well, look, we've got to make judgments. And this is where I'm placing the judgment about the trade-off between health and, he mentioned other things, psychological factors, economic factors. So, yes, we're all moral relativists. Right.
And even for Polis, yeah, he knows there is no way that he can prevent all deaths. I mean, even as the way that you sketch it out, the way you lay it out, I mean, if he keeps the controls on, there are going to be other things. There maybe is going to be a higher rate of suicide. There may be domestic violence that leads to a murder. There may be ways in which people who are very poor and can't get access to resources get sicker than they otherwise would and die, or have all kinds of other social ills that contribute to their early demise. It's why there isn't like a 100% safe way. On the other hand, I sense that what you're maybe calling out for a little bit is, could we be less murky about the whole thing? In other words, there's no way to run an algorithm that'll tell you exactly which choice will result in which outcomes, but you could probably come a little closer than what we heard from Polis.
Well, what I really wish for in our politics is more honesty. For that, just by the way, I didn't find Governor Polis to be especially dishonest. He was a little bit roundabout and circuitous in answering that question, but he was fundamentally acknowledging a tension between different values. And often in our political discussion, we don't do that. One side is good, the other is evil. One's choice is smart, the other is greedy or stupid or short-sighted. That's not really life. And the reason to tackle this stuff is not just to have a kind of a searching philosophical discussion as we're having right now. The reason I think the pandemic is an important moment in our politics is that most of the big issues for the next generation, Colin, I think are some version of this. Climate change and how to tackle that is a public policy that starkly puts different values in tension with one another. They're not necessarily mortally antagonistic. They can be balanced, but you have to acknowledge that there's a balance between people's right to do what they want, which is ordinarily an attractive goal, versus saving the planet from warming, which is obviously a moral imperative of its own. How do you balance those? Regulating technology, perfect example. Most of the big threats to our values, computers being used for surveillance and manipulation, they have the opportunity to do that because we like having this stuff in our lives, the technology. We give permission to companies to know our location. So these are values that are in tension with each other, and I think constructive politics would acknowledge that and have a debate about where to put the balance.
So, again, this all winds up not to keep casting it back into the realm of philosophy, but ultimately you have to have a presiding definition of public interest, right? So let's take climate change. Let's get away from COVID for a second. So you and I probably are pretty close on the issue of climate change, and that obviously the public interest in halting it or slowing it down as much as possible to limit the damage to the food supply, limit all the myriad ills, that pile up in a way that's starting to look very familiar right now. Climate change needs to be stopped. But there's the competing argument will also invoke public interest, right? They'll say the public interest in keeping our economies going with minimal amounts of disruption as we transition a little bit towards more sustainable forms of energy and more sustainable forms of growth. That's how you honor the public interest. You don't honor it by disrupting everything that we do based on one set of scientific observations. So I guess I'm wondering, John, maybe part of the problem is we don't agree what the public interest is.
Well, the public interest is never perfectly defined, and it's never resolved in a kind of a Cambridge or Oxford style debate. It's always going to be a messy, more chaotic, more unruly, and sometimes more distorted and even dishonest debate than we might wish in pure form. What I would say is that we can do a lot better than we do in acknowledging conflicting values, and that most of the difficult public policy issues facing us in the next generation are not black and white. There are some issues that do lend themselves to that more than others, and I think that's kind of how we got in the habit nationally of discussing things in such binary terms. There's not really a legitimate value to being racist, right? I think everybody say, well, that's a black and white issue. The good thing is to not be that, and the people who practice that are bad. So there's an issue that lends itself to rigid moralism, but a lot of issues do not. And I think the most important issues facing us over the next generation do not lend themselves to that. They lend themselves to competing priorities, competing values, defining the public interest through honest debate. And so in that sense, the pandemic is maybe a useful opportunity to develop some muscles that in our political culture have gotten very weak.
Yeah, I mean, and I hate to be the pessimist, although I seem to be that more these days. My concern is that the other side of this argument will use this current scenario to marshal its own case. They'll say, look, we know what happens when you slow down the economy because you want to do something about some other problem. We just watched that happen. We went into, and then you just plug in a depression or a huge recession or whatever this thing turns out to be when it's all over. They're going to say, we know what happened. We drove our economy off a cliff. Why would we want to do that again? I'm just wondering which lesson, John, people are going to take away. I think they'll take away the lesson that they like better.
Yeah, I suppose so. In many days, I'm as pessimistic as you are. I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago saying, stop looking on the bright side. We're going to be screwed by the pandemic for years to come. And I think that's a possibility. In a more optimistic mood, this most recent column I wrote, and I guess our conversation with you now is, I think that we do tend to muddle our way through in a messy and improvisational way, but the public interest does get defined. Anyway, so at least for today, I'm going to be optimistic.
Yeah, well, the good narrative is scientists told you about something that could happen for years and years and years, and everybody ignored it, and look at the mess we're in. And you could just plug climate change into that same thing. But I'm just wondering. I hope you're right, John. It's always great to talk to you, John Harris, founding editor and editor-in-chief of Politico magazine. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much. I hope to talk to you soon.
All right. So we're going to take a break. We're going to talk to Carl Zimmer, who knows everything really about science. That may be building them up a little bit too much. On the other hand, it may be just a very fair statement. One of America's preeminent science writers. He's going to talk about the race for a vaccine, which the New York Times covered comprehensively.
It was easy then to tell truth from lies, selling out from compromise, who to love and who to hate, the foolish from the wise. But today there is no day or night.
Carl Zimmer is the author of 13 books about science. His newest book is She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Power, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity. His column Matter appears each week in the New York Times, and he's an adjunct professor at Yale. He was one of the writers who worked on this weekend's New York Times piece. But what's at stake in the rush to find a vaccine against the coronavirus that causes COVID-19? Carl, welcome back to our show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with today's news, and then we can probably work backwards from there to all the stuff that you guys reported on. So today in Brussels, there's this weird kind of, like telethon or something taking place where world leaders are pledging money to raise at least $8 billion for research into a possible vaccine and treatments for the coronavirus, with the goal also of somehow or other taking it out of nationalist interests and creating something for the world as opposed to an originating country. Absent would be one key country, unless you count Melinda Gates. The United States is, as I understand it, not there as part of this. So tell us about this, Carl.
Right. So this is a gathering organized by the European Union, but there are a number of other countries like Canada that are also involved, and they're basically trying to drum up interest in, I don't know, a vaccine that could save the world. How about that? And so what they're doing is the governments are pledging money towards this goal, and they're also agreeing to a number of sort of sharing protocols, I guess you could say, where they're going to be sharing research and also be working together to distribute a vaccine should there one be discovered. And so, yeah, the United States is not at this meeting. Neither is China. And that tells you a lot about kind of where we are in 2020 dealing with a vaccine for a disease that's basically threatening the entire world.
Right. So the bad news is that all these different countries, or certainly these two big players that you mentioned, and lots of projects are kind of all over the place. But that's also the good news, right? And just in the sense that to put too much effort into one particular project probably doesn't give us the scientific diversity that we would hope for, just to create a larger prospect of stumbling over the right answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, what people have to remember is like, by some estimates, only about 6% of vaccine projects make it from sort of the initial design of the vaccine and experiments with animals to actually getting into people. So a lot of them fail. They don't work out. And so if you were to put all your hopes on one vaccine and say, well, this is it, what if it's one of the ones that doesn't work? So there are, it's hard to figure out exactly how many vaccine projects there are. Honestly, there are so many. There are definitely over 90. I've seen some estimates that are over 100. And they take very different approaches, and that's good. Experts say, essentially, like, that's more shots on goal. More chance that you're going to have at least one that succeeds, and maybe you'll have a few that succeed, and that would be actually even better.
Right. But there's also this question of scalability. And one of the things pointed out in the work that you guys did is, it's not even just having a vaccine. It's having X billion appropriate pieces of medical glass. I mean, you can't, just ladle this stuff out of vats into syringes. It's all going to have to be manufactured and packaged a certain way. And that's a problem.
Yeah. I mean, you have to bear in mind that this is the biggest vaccine undertaking ever. And that's saying a lot. I mean, vaccines have really transformed our health. And, there are these amazing stories, for example, of smallpox. We eradicated smallpox from the earth. And we did it with vaccines. And it was a really huge, long process, but it was a success. But here, what we're trying to do is we are trying to get vaccines, as you say, to ideally 7 billion people. We're trying to do it in record time. The record by far for a vaccine was 4 years. That was the mumps vaccine in the 60s. Typically, it can take 10 to 15 years for a vaccine to work. And we have a number of diseases that people have been trying for decades. Like, we don't have an HIV vaccine yet. So to say, oh, we're going to get this done in a year and a half, that's bold.
On the other hand, I mean, we get presumably as a species better and better at coming up with these kinds of solutions. And, one thing that I didn't quite understand until I read the piece that you guys did, and I'm not even sure I 100% understand all of it now, is that, so I grew up with the idea of a vaccine being sort of a weak version of the pathogen, a weakened pathogen that essentially teaches my immune system or warns my immune system so it ramps up. And that's not like what 100% of vaccine projects are at this point, right?
Right. I mean, that's sort of the classic approach. So, the rabies vaccine was one of the first vaccines ever made, and that was a weakened virus, and a lot of the vaccines that we get these days are weakened or inactivated viruses. The viruses itself, and it's in your body, and your immune system can get to know it without you getting sick because it can't replicate. But scientists have been moving beyond that. So, for example, they've said, like, well, let's just take a little fragment of the virus, a little protein chunk, and just use that instead. And the most, there are lots of new kinds of vaccine designs, like let's just stick some DNA into your body, and your cells will read the DNA and make that little virus protein on their own. And then, so basically, you are sort of making your own body the factory to generate the chemicals that your immune system is going to use to learn. So there's wide range of these new approaches, and they're all being tested right now.
And there's also a little bit of variety of possible protocols for testing. So, on one version, you move through ferrets and macaques and stuff like that. But there is this protocol called a challenge trial. Explain that.
Right. So vaccines are the most rigorously tested form of medicine of all. And the reason is that vaccines are intended to be given to many, many millions of people, billions of people, the vast majority of whom are healthy. So you're not like giving a drug to someone who's sick in order to cure them. You're treating healthy people. So to make healthy people sick would be really bad. So vaccines go through lots and lots of safety testing, first in animals and then in people. And and then you actually see whether it works by just basically giving people the vaccine and then just let them go about their lives and then see who gets sick and who doesn't and compare that to people who just get a placebo. And that takes a long time. So there's an alternative, a challenge trial that some experts are advocating for. And the idea is this, that you take a much smaller group of people, you vaccinate them all, and then you give them the virus. You stick the virus right in them. You try to make them sick, and then you see if it works. That can save you a whole lot of time. But the flip side is you are giving people this coronavirus, and there's no really good cure for it. There's a drug, remdesivir, which it helps, but still people are really concerned, like, it's not right to be doing that to people when you don't really have a good treatment as backup. So, but still, there are thousands of people who have actually been volunteering, saying like, "Hey, I'd be happy to do this." So, this potentially could be part of how we speed things up.
Although, I mean, one of the concerns that I would have, I mean, one of the reasons I won't be one of the volunteers has to do with something that you brought up quite some time ago, which is this is a really weird virus. From the standpoint of virology, this is a weird virus. It doesn't map all that well onto even the behavior of other coronaviruses. There's still stuff that the facilities are still trying to figure out. There's this whole problem, this kind of hypercoagulation problem that can happen, doesn't always happen. There's these huge kinds of inflammation responses, some of which seem to happen when the virus is kind of on the way out, isn't really as present in the body. The body is still left with all these gigantic issues, some of which hospitals are getting smarter and smarter at treating and screening for pulmonary embolisms all the time and trying to figure out if there's going to be thrombosis in the leg. Is that where the leg just went numb? This is a strange critter. And so even knowing how to take care of those human challenge volunteers in an appropriate way is maybe something, it's maybe a place we're not kind of at right now, but respond to that.
So, it's striking that all of these things that people are discovering about the coronavirus, and really, what it means is that we are encountering a new disease for the first time, and having to deal with it really fast. And so, doctors may be sort of approaching it with certain paradigms in mind. People kind of initially sort of likened it to the flu or to pneumonia, and this is different. It's definitely different. I mean, it can go after the kidneys, for example, which when you get the flu, like you don't really think, oh, maybe I'll have to go on dialysis. Unfortunately, that's an issue with this. So if anyone's going to do a challenge trial, they have to really come up with a really detailed informed consent. And partly that informed consent is going to depend on all the observations that doctors are making right now to say to people like, okay, well, if you do this, here are the chances you just won't feel anything at all. Here are the chances that you'll feel something kind of like a bad cold. Here are the chances that you might have a stroke. Strokes are a problem in a few cases. It's going to, I don't think that people should volunteer for this lightly. Now, that being said, certainly it would make sense, some have argued, to have younger people do this in their 20s because the fatality rate is much lower for them. But on the other hand, it's not as if people in their 20s are immune to, we've seen these heartbreaking stories of people, relatively young people just suddenly having strokes. This should not be something to enter into lightly.
It seems as though the process of maybe identifying that kind of person runs on a parallel track to a process that we're all going to have to be part of at a certain point, which is ultimately, it seems to me that there's going to have to be some kind of risk factor algorithm, a thing that feeds as many of our variables into it as possible and may change from day to day and just looks at the probability of certain things happening to us. And I'll give you an example. I mean, you know so much more about this, but you mentioned remdesivir. Well, so remdesivir is kind of complicated too, because it seems to work way earlier in the process, but it's not something your doctor can phone in a script for or something. This is an intravenously administered drug. Most people don't show up to places where they could get intravenous drugs early in their symptomatic process with COVID-19 because they're told, well, stay home until it gets really bad. So remdesivir, at least initially, if it works, it might work a little bit more like Tamiflu, where that really early window where you get the antiviral would be helpful. But you're not likely to get it early in the process for all the reasons that I just laid out, unless you had some kind of understanding that you were higher risk for some reason, that maybe you ought to rush to the front of the line for the remdesivir because you're going to get a worse COVID than the average person. I don't think we have that tool yet, but you understand what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Sure.
About it. It seems likely that we need that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No. And that kind of understanding is coming together, and people. I do think that within a few months, patients will be, first of all, they'll be testing so that people will find out sooner whether they're actually sick or not, and then it may be possible to do a profile of people and say, like, okay, we've taken a look, and this virus is replicating very fast. You've got a heavy dose. We're very concerned. We need to start you on some sort of antiviral right away. It may also be that along the way, scientists will be keeping track of the immune system, because actually, like, one of the most dangerous things, it seems, is that our immune system, after a while, just starts to misfire, and instead of controlling the virus, just goes berserk and attacks ourselves. And there may be some certain drugs, which are now in clinical trials right now, which could just sort of tame that down. So you might get a cocktail of something like remdesivir or some other drug to keep the virus in check, something to keep the immune system in check, and it could all be adjusted based on your profile. That could happen, but it's not happening right now. We're not there yet.
Right, and the probability is that remdesivir, it's a first-generation antiviral. It's going to be the second or third-generation antiviral that really works a little bit more effectively. As you say, probably in a cocktail with something that helps push away that cytokine storm, but also possibly in a cocktail that includes some kind of monoclonal antibodies, right? I mean, that's one of the other frontiers, is to ultimately try to get a way of synthesizing something like the antibodies that would be in your system. I mean, we should emphasize for the listeners, we're now talking about treatments. I'm going to kind of circle back to vaccines at the end of my conversation with you, Carl, but in that shorter window of treatment, it's probably going to be maybe a few things layered on top of one another.
Well, yeah, that's what scientists I've talked to have been talking about. And this, this will all be moving much faster than vaccines. I mean, so vaccines are going as fast as the vaccine project can go, but that's going to take longer. But, when people are sick right now, you can say, like, okay, like, let's see if this drug can help. And scientists actually are screening thousands and thousands of drugs that are already approved by the FDA to see if any of them also happen to work against COVID-19. And lo and behold, I've written about this in the Times this week, a few dozen of them do. They do really well. And it doesn't matter that they are used, like Thorazine, which is used for schizophrenia, or certain allergy drugs and so on. At least in experiments on cells, infected cells, they do really well, better than remdesivir, much better. And so now scientists are saying, okay, like, boom, let's start these animal tests. Let's try it out. And then maybe we can go with some of the really good ones to clinical trials soon. I mean, like, maybe this month or next month. I mean, like, things are moving fast.
Right. So it's possible that, by September or October, we might have it's probable that we would have a more effective cocktail, treatment cocktail that might help ward off some of these extreme situations where the patient just decompensates and gets, really incredibly sick very quickly. But meanwhile, the resumption of life, just to go back to the conversation with John Harris that preceded this, is probably dependent on a vaccine. And we know when a vaccine will be ready because President Trump said it'll be ready by the end of the year. So, Merry Christmas, I guess. But realistically, Carl, there's no way to know, particularly with 100 or so different projects going and different protocols and different methodologies and stuff. But I mean, what's a realistic way of talking about the vaccine timeline?
Well, what is happening is that that scientists they've already made a bunch of vaccines, and that there are already are the first sort of human safety trials have already begun. And on top of that, some of these vaccines are already starting to be manufactured in the hope that they will turn out to pass all these tests. So things are rolling along really fast. Now, And some of these corporations, I mean, you talk about what President Trump is saying, but like some of these corporations like AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson have made some pretty bold declarations, saying maybe by the beginning of next year, for example, they would have the first batches of vaccines that could be used like in an emergency use. And so that wouldn't be for everybody, but that might mean, first responders might start getting vaccinated. That would be great, but that all assumes that all the stars align and something does work out and it's all good. It will take longer for things to be mass produced and to be distributed and so on. So, maybe sometime in 2021, maybe.
Maybe. So AstraZeneca, just since you used that example, a British corporation, I think they're working in conjunction with that Oxford group. That sort of sounds like a British vaccine where everybody in the United Kingdom or however they decide to define it gets it first, and then we can talk about the rest of us. But first of all, is that the way it's likely to work in a lot of these scenarios? I mean, I know Macron and all those people who are part of this Brussels thing today are saying, no, that's not a good way to do it. But isn't it kind of likely that is kind of how they might do it?
I don't think we can really predict that. I mean, as you say, a number of countries have made this pledge that they're going to work together for an equitable distribution of the vaccine. They have said that, and I don't know. I just have to say, if some country says we have the vaccine and we're going to vaccinate all our people first, that's not going to generate a lot of global goodwill. I mean, this is a once in a lifetime event, and any country that just says we don't really care about the rest of the world, we matter most of all, I think is going to lose a lot of goodwill going forward. So we'll see. There are mechanisms in place, organizations like Gavi, for example, for getting this vaccine out to lots of places. And, there are lots of places where they're not going to be able to have lots of expensive ventilators and expensive drugs. Developing countries are going to need the vaccine most of all because these other solutions aren't going to work really very well for keeping the disease in check. So I certainly hope that we try to think of ourselves as a species rather than one nation overall.
Well, I hope that you are right. What they should all do is watch Contagion. In Contagion, they have this like the lottery. You get the ping pong balls, and the birthday comes up, and everybody with that birthday gets it. It seems extraordinarily fair, although left very much also to chance. Carl Zimmer, so I know you're a busy guy these days, so thank you so much for taking a bunch of time to talk to us about this.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, Carl Zimmer from the New York Times, and you should read their coverage of the vaccine project. It dropped over the weekend. So you don't have enough to worry about, do you? So we're going to give you something else to be worried about. And it's especially worried if you happen to be listening to this and you are a honeybee. It's not going to be good news. We are back. It is time to say some quick thank yous. Those thank yous go to Kat Pastor, who is there in the studio making this whole thing happen and making it possible for me and for Betsy Kaplan, the producer of this episode, to work from our homes. Thanks also to Gina Amatruda. I should say that our technical staff, there's stuff that happens all the time, just glitches that come up, problems that come up that we just couldn't possibly anticipate. There's no playbook for doing what we're doing right now. Like so many other parts of the media, every day we put out a little fire. And when I say we, I mean they do. So we were having problems with the thing that connects me to the radio studio, and Gene figured out a way to fix that. So thanks. I can't thank you guys enough. So, and I think Betsy too. Okay, that's everybody, basically. And then I also want to tell you that tomorrow we're going to re-air a show that we did that I really love this show. And we are using a few shows from our vault these days just because I think, first of all, you guys need a break from all the COVID stuff, and maybe something a little uplifting. And also, we just need time to sort of step back and plan stuff. And so we do that. And tomorrow's show is about Joni Mitchell. But what we did was we had people come in with one song, various people that we knew who loved music or who were kind of interesting fans of Joni Mitchell. Each of them came and had a conversation with me about one song. So all these different songs, and they wind up kind of telling the stories of their lives a little bit too, or either that or revealing who they are. So it's not your typical Joni Mitchell show. Joni Mitchell does not appear on the show. Okay, so enough. Yes, you needed one more thing to be worried about. So there's actually something called the Murder Hornet or Murder Hornets, and they have come to the Pacific Northwest, which also seems like it's had more than its fair share of troubles lately. Here to tell us more about it is Mike Baker, the Seattle bureau chief for the New York Times. It's New York Times Day here on the show, as it often is. So, Mike Baker, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, yeah, this was sort of not great news for anybody to read about this weekend, this Asian giant hornet, but it's especially bad news if you're a honeybee. But let's just start with the hornet itself. What the hell is this thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big hornet. It's sort of that's the thing that stands out the most. It's found primarily in Asia. It comes from Asia, but really surfaced here in the Northwest and in lower British Columbia in the past 6 months or so. And so it's not really much clarity about how it got introduced here, but as with typical global trade, it's not a huge surprise. But now there's an extensive effort to make sure it doesn't establish itself and essentially become a permanent invasive species here.
Right. And so why is it called a murder hornet? Explain that.
It's a funny story. So when I was reporting this story out, one of the nicknames I heard along the way that it was called the yak killer hornet, and we were trying to figure out at the time, like, what, did it kill a yak somewhere along the way? Like, what's the origin story on this nickname? And when I talked to this researcher in Japan, he goes, "Oh, we don't call it the yak killer at all. I just call it the murder hornet." And so that was sort of the first place I had heard that nickname come up. But it's along with being being large with a large stinger and potent venom, it can kill people in group attacks. It kills a few dozen people a year in Japan, but it can also as a major predator of the honeybee. It can kill thousands of them in just a few hours. That's just how powerful they are.
Right. And so we should say a little bit more about this because obviously honeybees, what with colony collapse disorder, honeybees have also had more than their fair share of trouble already. And I think it was Einstein who said that, if you want to find out what's going to happen to everything, just watch honeybees. They're that important to the whole ecosystem of food production and human life and stuff like that. So, so obviously the people who have the greatest interest in stopping the spread of murder hornets in the United States would be beekeepers. But what can they do about this thing? I mean, I realize that the queen can be 2 inches long, and that's, in a lineup, you're going to be able to pick the murder hornet out from other hornets really easily. But like, how do you stop a hornet?
I mean, it's a tough situation because, they're not sure how long they've been here. We've only had 2 confirmed sightings, and they came right in the end of fall last year, and right when we're heading into winter and you're expecting, basically the queens to overwinter before. And now is the season where they're actually going to start emerging again and a chance to track them down. So there's a few different strategies right now. One is huge surveillance, making people aware of this thing, call and report if you see something like it, send in a picture. We'll, even if you're not sure, send something in, we can tell you yes or no, and at least have sort of a bunch of eyes around. And then the other is setting up traps all over that part of Washington state to find out, if they can catch one. Certainly if they can catch a queen, that would be ideal to prevent a new nest from from emerging. And then later this summer, it's going to be a little bit more, hundreds more traps out there that they can monitor to see, all right, well, if there's one in a trap here, we must be close to a nest. Let's advance and try and track them even further. One of the incredible details on that was there's a variety of strategies they're looking at. One is thermal imaging, because the nests in the ground are supposed to be about 86 degrees because of all the activity inside. So they might be able to figure out where they are based off of that kind of work. And then the other was, if they can catch one in a trap, maybe they can attach a string or a streamer or an RFID tag to it and follow it that way back to where it's resting. And it just pretty remarkable to think that the Hornet's big enough to be able to handle a string attached to it and still fly on back to where it came from.
Right. And so, and that's important. It's important to understand that, like a lot of these kinds of insects, they do sort of work as a team. And you have these worker hornets who, they're the ones who go out and maybe they figure out where the bees are. And then the next thing you know, you got a massacre on your hands. But these hornets also, I mean, if you found the nest, if you wanted to eradicate the nest, if you wanted to do something, you would have to approach with caution, right? I mean, a beekeeper in Vancouver approached them in his sort of full bee sting proof beekeeper suit, and that wasn't necessarily what he needed, right?
Yeah, so their strategy, they had this one on Vancouver Island that was basically the only nest that has actually been found, and they went out and at nighttime, all the hornets are back in the nest. The goal was basically to eradicate it, collect some samples so we can, figure out more about this specific branch of the hornet. He describes how the rustling of the bushes and his flashlight that he's got on his head, must have awakened the nest in some way. And so they came out, which is, it's not like a huge thing for a guy who's used to having his, wandering out with his beekeeping suit on. He's got thick sweatpants on underneath the beekeeping suit, shorts underneath his sweatpants. And even then, as he's getting ready to douse the nest with carbon dioxide, he starts feeling the stings in his legs. And I mean, not to get too grotesque for your audience, but he's describing it as feeling like red hot thumbtacks just driving into his flesh, and they're drawn. Later on, he sees they've drawn blood. He's a guy who's been stung thousands of times in his life and in his work, and he says these were the most painful that he's ever experienced.
Right. I mean, exactly. I mean, if you keep bees, you're going to get stung now and then, and maybe even a lot. And for him, this is still this kind of epic experience of pain. Well, I guess my last question, Mike, would be, I mean, the Pacific Northwest has been through a lot. Washington State, really kind of the first of the hot spots for COVID. And then this thing comes along, and it's not the same thing, except that when you talk about it and tracking it and figuring out where the hornet hotspots are, it starts to sound a little bit similar. And psychologically, I don't know, how are people in Washington State handling all this?
Well, I think there is. I mean, are you talking to the folks who are working on this? You do see the similarities of like, okay, we found two. We certainly didn't find the only two, right? Like there's some sort of iceberg underneath this, and how big is the iceberg is essentially the question right now. And so it's a lot of surveillance, tracking, trying to figure out and how to contain this thing. And at the same time, it's been a little bit tough because there's, the researchers aren't going, they're trying to travel out in separate cars. The beekeepers, we're holding meetings on this kind of thing to try and figure out strategies and how to share traps and work together. And, there's some limitations just logistically on that kind of stuff. And so the whole thing is, there's some parallels here and some interesting,
starting to sound a little too familiar. All right.
Yeah,
Mike,
exactly.
Mike Baker, thank you so much for your time. We got to go. Show's over. Thanks to Mike Baker, to Carl Zimmer, and John Harris.
But now she is coming back home to me.